Good
What's up?
morning.
How are you?
Wonderful. How are you guys?
I am doing well. Doing well. It's interesting to see you in a hat. I feel like you're normally like the blazer.
Yeah, I could do both actually at the same
Really?
time.
Yeah.
hmm Yeah.
Nice.
I went out for a
Hey,
walk. It's a little hot.
very nice today. Um,
Morning.
hey, hey, Bonan, how are you?
So far, so good. And you guys?
Doing good, man. Appreciate you jumping on. Hey, Jessica. Oh, I think
Good
you're
morning.
morning. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Yeah, thanks. How about yourself?
Yeah, doing very well.
Good.
Adam, good to see you. I know you're picking up your kids. John, good to see you as well.
Jessica,
Howdy,
I don't
howdy.
think we've met.
No, we
Hey,
haven't. I'm
I'm
Jessica.
Grace. How's it going?
Grace?
Grace.
Nice- Oh,
Mhm.
Grace. Grace, nice to meet you. I'm having some trouble with my audio, but I'll try and
Nice.
fix it.
No worries. Hey, Arash, good to see you.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Doing good. How are you?
Good, good, good.
Good. Awesome.
It's so hot
Cool.
in here, so barely surviving.
Remind me, where are you at in the world? Where are you based out of?
Oh, me? Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm in Ottawa, Ontario.
Ah, got it.
Yeah.
Cool.
So we are just getting started with the summer, and then it's so damn hot.
Yeah, it's awesome. How it goes. Hey, John, good
Yeah.
to see you, man.
How's it going?
Good. Doing good. Tyler, good to see you.
Hey man, how are you? I can only stay for half
Doing
an hour today, but I'm excited. So
no worries, man. No worries. Hopefully, yeah. All right. Well, appreciate everybody jumping on here. I am recording this call, so we'll send it out afterwards as well. And Ed, I will monitor the waiting room and let people in as they hop in here. But today's facilitator is Ed Lynes. Ed is the managing partner and co-founder of a company called Woden. They create strategic narratives for essential brands. Two-time bootstrapper, ran a telecom company that I'm sure he will tell you about. Used to be the head of sales at this company before going into Thrive. So I was excited to get him on. He's in Philly too, as is like a big portion of the Thrive community. So Ed, I will go ahead and throw things over to you and let you talk about, how to use storytelling in the business.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. Well, it's really great to be here with all of you today. So thanks for taking your lunch hour to hang out with me. As you guys know, we'll be here for about an hour. Based on the comment I heard a second ago, I'll try to make sure the first half an hour, Tyler, is the best half an hour, and then we'll put all the crap at the end for you. So as Eric mentioned, my name's Ed, managing partner at a firm called Woden. We do strategic narrative for essential brands, as he noted. So my contact information, obviously, feel free to reach out to me before or after the webinar if there's anything here that you think is interesting. But before I get into what I want to talk about today, I want to tell my own kind of bootstrapping story, as Eric mentioned. So Woden is fourth company I've been a part of, and starting and building, and never had to go out to the market to raise before, which is pretty exciting. But my current company, Woden, our origin is in my last business, which, as Eric mentioned, was a telecom company. So before I started Woden, my business partner Dan and I had this telecom business. We sold bulk telecom to student housing providers. So if any of you know anything about the telecom market, it's exceptionally commodified. And when we started the company, we felt like we kind of had all the right pieces in place. We had a good product, so we thought good team, good go-to-market strategy. And I would get in front of all of our prospective customers, who were these big publicly traded real estate companies, and the conversation would almost always go the same way. They would say, "Ed, we love you guys. We totally hate your competitors. We were competing against like AT&T and Time Warner, companies like that." And they would say, "Look, if you can beat those guys on price, we'll sign with you." So as you can imagine, my startup competing on price against the Fortune 500 was not a winning strategy for us. And really had to figure out, like, why did people not understand our value, really understand like why what we do is different. And we went through kind of a process internally, did a little bit of research, and we uncovered that the kids who lived in our properties tended to renew their leases at a higher rate than those of competitors, which we thought was kind of pretty interesting. And we did a little more research, and it turns out that student housing, our market, telecom is the number one amenity. So kids care more about good TV and internet than the pool, the gym, or kind of anything else in the building. So we totally took our story as a company and turned it away from our product. We stopped talking about internet speeds, uptimes, channel lineups, and entirely started telling the story around what we call the digital tenant experience. This idea of keeping heads in beds, speeding lease up, reducing lease turnover. And what we saw was that when we did that, the pricing objection totally fell away. Our company really took off. We ultimately sold it to a firm called Boingo. We came out of this experience realizing that for us, the difference between barely being able to make payroll and ultimately a very successful exit was this ability to kind of tell a story that got people to understand what our value was and why we were different. And I know from talking to Eric, he's mentioned that on other webinars, people have had comments like, I get ghosted after every meeting, none of my ads are creating leads, getting asked what to do is my worst nightmare. And so what I want to do today is hope you guys kind of think a little bit about how to go through that same journey of telling a story that articulates your value clearly, helps pull people through your funnel, and ultimately gets them to want to do business with you. So the webinar today, there's kind of 4 things that I want to cover with you all. So number 1, really want to get us aligned around like why a great product or service just isn't enough. And that's unfortunate for those of us who spend so much time working on our products, developing the services, really investing in them, but they're just not enough in today's day and age to be competitive and to win. Number 2, I want to really talk about like how your story as a company is the big thing that makes you essential to your prospects and your customers, and how you can really kind of leverage a structure behind that to build a successful and effective sales funnel across your customer journey. So if we're successful today, you should have a couple good ideas about how to build out your own story, and I think more importantly, start telling it to your audience. As we go through this, I'll share a couple things about kind of our own way that we approach this internally, maybe some more stories about my last company, Elowit, and certainly can dive into things that come through the chat as we go. So I want to start kind of with this idea of talking about why it really is that the great product or service just isn't enough. And there's a couple things I think that kind of sit behind why that is, right? So when you think about kind of like why you started your own company, right? Like you clearly had like this very intuitive understanding of your market. You knew what the opportunity was out there. You have a passion for why it is you're doing what you do. But the reality is when new products like yours come into the market, they don't deliver value immediately. If you guys have ever read the book, The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen, you know that there's this S-curve of how products and services develop, right? They deliver a lot of incremental value, and then they kind of flatten out at a point where buyers are really happy. So to bring a product to market and to be really successful growing a bootstrap company, right, you can't rely on the product itself to deliver enough value to propel your go-to-market motion. And I think it particularly is like if you're bootstrapping your company, you obviously can't rely on burning investor cash for a couple of years while you go through like endless pivots and figure out like what is the right way to kind of go to market. So what I want to kind of explore are 3 quick reasons why a great product isn't enough, and then we'll talk a little bit about how you guys are going to do something about that. So the first thing is buyers are not rational. We all like to think that if we can get in front of our customer and show them like what we're doing and why it's great and how it works and what the mechanics of it are, that people are going to make a very educated, hyper-rational decision and say, great, I've looked at this, the pricing makes sense, there's clear ROI, I'm going to buy it. And if that worked, I'm sure every one of us on this call would be a billionaire by now. But the reality is like people buy solutions to problems, and problems can be perceived or actual, which means like how I think about a problem state as a buyer is a very emotional thing. We often trick ourselves into making the same bad decisions over and over and over and over again because we tell ourselves that they're the right thing to do, even if they're not. So we have to think about our buyers making decisions emotionally and recognize that they're always going to cherry pick and seek out the kind of facts and figures or product features and benefits that rationalize an emotional buying decision. And if you're going to build a really effective funnel and a really effective sales process for your product, you have to be thinking about winning the emotional sale and then validating it with the product, as opposed to trying to kind of lead with a product that's going to make sense to the buyer in the first place. The second thing is that today there is more choice than there ever has been, and buyers are more educated about it than ever. There's been a lot of research that shows today that when someone enters your buying journey, they've likely already explored a bunch of different options. They've spent a lot of time doing their own independent research. You think about the amount of information we have at our fingertips today compared to even kind of 10 or 15 years ago. That also means that there's infinite choices. If a buyer has a problem to solve, there might not be a directly competitive product out there, but they can probably pop on the internet and find someone that will do something kind of close to what you do. So we really have to think about like, how do we navigate this complexity of choice and this education of our buyer and put them in a position where they feel like they're making their own decision. I really believe you can't push people through a sales funnel anymore. You've got to pull them forward in a way that makes them want to progress and want to continue to kind of engage in this process with you. You see this if any of you guys have a B2B product. There's a variation of this that plays out in a B2B sale, where buying committees have become much more complex. Maybe a handful of years ago, you'd have 1 or 2 people that could sign up on the sale. It seems like even the simplest sort of SaaS sale these days just gets bogged down in endless amounts of people that want to weigh in on the decision, present alternatives, and you have to be able to think about how you're going to navigate that kind of situation of choice. And then the third truth I would kind of drop in front of you guys is this idea that the reality is like your competition is actually the status quo. We like to think, again, as we come into market, we do all of our kind of market and competitive research. We say, okay, we can beat whoever this upstart is. But the reality is, whether it's an incumbent company or whether it's just not doing anything, the real competition that you have to sell against and that you have to make a case against is doing nothing. At any given point in time, only about 5% of your buyers are going to actually be in market for your solution. So that means 95% of the people that you come across, you're not compelling them to buy you versus somebody else. You're compelling them to make a buying decision, period, right? To come into the market, to think about the problem they have to solve. And to do that, you have to sell against not another company that's out there, but you've really got to sell against why change is required and why the status quo that the person is enduring today is just no longer acceptable. So if you have to deal with these kind of 3 things, the question is, what really is the durable advantage that you can build if it's not your product? And what I would argue as we go through things today is that really kind of the most incredible advantage that you can develop at this moment is a story that takes your value beyond the product and communicates it to the buyer in a way that's clear and compelling and memorable. So why is that? Well, if you've noticed, we're currently experiencing a pretty rapid shift in how people communicate. The facts that I just shared a few minutes ago are playing out against this kind of complete change in human communication. You think about how first the internet and then the mobile phone and social media messaging apps have totally upended the ways that people take in and share and consume information. It's had major impacts, not just in how we build relationships with one another, but actually how the buying journey itself works. What's cool about companies that are like in a bootstrapping community, though, is that this creates an enormous opportunity for new market entrants. You turn the clock back to like the 80s or the 90s, the only way that you would have been able to build a product, right, is through having massive amounts of capital at your disposal to advertise and market and go through those kind of relatively few channels like newspapers and radio, right, that you would have to kind of reach your buyer. Today, you've got this massive democratization of information, and that gives you an opportunity to win if you've got the right ideas that you can put in front of your audience. So for me, like what I think about when I look at what we're experiencing today, and my belief is that it feels new and different because we're all on LinkedIn or we're on WhatsApp or whatever messaging app that we're on, but that what we're experiencing is actually a reimagination of something quite old. And if you look at the majority of time that people have been on the planet, the entire way that they've communicated has been orally. Literacy is actually a relatively recent invention of humans. For most of the time that we've existed, we've spread things entirely through kind of oral storytelling. I would say something to John. If John thought it was interesting, and share it with Eric. Maybe Eric would kind of modify and change that idea, share it with Jessica. Jessica would just think it's a terrible idea and she wouldn't tell anybody. And what you would see is that over time, like ideas would refine and change and almost kind of follow this like survival of the fittest, right? And we really developed as a species mechanisms for sharing critical information, holding on to it, and kind of putting it in front of the people that needed to hear it. And that's where storytelling really kind of came from in the first place. We kind of lost sight of that for a little bit, but what we're seeing today is that the behaviors people exhibit digitally are essentially just a reimagination of the oral tradition. That same way of taking and appending and blocking out or sharing and spreading information that we believe is most critical to be successful in community are the same behaviors that your buyers exhibit, whether they're on LinkedIn, whether they're forwarding or sharing information within their company through email or in a meeting or something like that. And so we have to really kind of go back, if anything, forward to thinking about how people shared and spread information thousands of years ago when they were sitting around the campfire, if they're going to be successful and if you're going to bring your product to market. So for me, that's really about this idea of kind of building and securing that emotional connection that you have with your buyer. Stories are the things that our brains have developed and our species have developed to take and share the information that we know is most critical. And there's a couple of reasons why this works. Stories take really complex ideas and they make them simple and understandable. So you think about like if you've got a technology product you're selling, or even like a complex service, like a coaching product, it can be really hard to get people's head around the complexity of your methodology, what you offer, The story takes that, makes it simple, it makes it understandable. That means it's easy to remember, and it's also easy to pass on. But what's really powerful about stories in the current moment is that when someone hears what you're doing, hears about your product, hears about your service in the form of a story, and then they go out and retell that, that becomes their own story. So it allows people to gain ownership of your own brand's kind of narrative and the ideas that sit behind it, and really makes them want to go out and tell it. When someone has a story-driven brand and they excel using that brand, and they go retell that story to somebody else, they're not telling the brand story, they're telling their own story. And that really spurs a lot of the evangelism that's going to put you guys in a position to be successful. So the first kind of big takeaway I would have for you today as we get into talking about how to do this is to keep in mind, people aren't buying the product, they're buying the story of what that product makes possible. They're buying the story that they can tell other people about what they've been able to do, what they've been able to achieve. And I think the companies today that are most successful actually hold off on introducing a lot of the product information until fairly late in the buying process. So they can, going back to a point I made earlier, secure that emotional sale with the buyer before they introduce the idea of the product that sits around it. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how you actually do that and how you build a story, right, that can help you kind of become essential. So good stories are always kind of anchored in this idea of belief. I think people buy from brands that they really feel like share their purpose, share their values, right? Particularly today, who you buy from and who you do business with says a lot about who you are, and you want to feel like you've got good identification behind that. You think about all of you starting your companies. You started this because there's something that you believe about the world. You know, we all know that entrepreneurship is a difficult journey. Like no one does this just for kind of laughs, right? You do it because you really believe in something and you want to bring that into reality. So when I think about kind of building out the story that you want to tell, I start not by thinking about the product that you're selling, but I really think about the purpose behind why your brand exists in the first place. And I think that's what you're going to want to build around as you talk about that. So to me, like building a good purpose is really about getting out of kind of features and benefits. It's really kind of about getting out of, sort of like the mechanics of how the product works. And what I want you to do is really think about kind of 4 things as you start to crystallize how you talk about your brand purpose. And I'm going to talk about how this kind of becomes the cornerstone of the story. So the first big thing you need to think about is, what is this kind of big, undeniable change that you see in the world? Great brands are always built around this kind of idea of change, this idea of kind of before and after. We'll talk about that in a second. A great kind of purpose for your brand. It's empowering to your audience, but it's also authentic to who you are, because you have to form that kind of basis of trust and connection with your buyer. It can't be about the features and benefits of the product. It's really going to be about this lesson that you're trying to teach and this connection that you're trying to build with your buyer. So some of the kind of coolest examples of that, right? You think about like ideas like software is eating the world, right? We live in a subscription economy. Brands that talk about things like the execution gap, right? Or the future belongs to knowledgeable sellers in the case of a brand like Gone, right? What you see in all of these instances is that there are a big, bold claim about how the world is changing and what the brand believes. And the power of that is that before the person even understands the product, it creates an immediate recognition of, I see that too, and I believe in that too. I would call this the idea of like an old world and a new world. So you think about building out your brand story. You want to create this contrast between the way things were and the way things are going to be in the future. What you have to do as you create that contrast is have a very kind of clear sense of stakes behind that. So you think about, you saw an opportunity out there. The world used to be this way. And in this before state, you've got to paint that there's real dire stakes to not changing. There's losers and winners on either side of this change. Your brand sits in the middle of it, right? There's going to be a lot of obstacles that help a brand get from the old world to the new world. The function of like your company and your company's belief statement is to help people navigate that gap between old and new and put themselves in a position to be successful. I really find that the companies that really kind of do this most effectively have a belief statement that maybe their buyer hasn't thought about before or hasn't seen in a particular way. But when they share it with the buyer, a light bulb kind of goes off and the buyer says, yeah, that makes complete sense. And I think when you can add that value or get that kind of perception shift to happen within the customer, you want to immediately gain a lot of credibility in their eyes. But you also make them, again, want to go through the buying journey, because now they're talking to someone who doesn't just have a product that could be useful for them, but they're talking to someone who fundamentally sees the world in the same way that they do. So I tell you, for kind of thinking about this, to me, you really want to anchor the structure of this around, what do you believe is changing about the world? What is the thing, the status quo, that's going to no longer exist in the future? And how do you really carve out a statement of belief, kind of call your shot around how that's going to change and what exists on kind of either side of that. I think, kind of dictates the arc of the story and the belief that kind of sits at the center of it. And again, I'll tell you, like the brands I've seen that are most successful, not only do they lead with this, but they've got a really clear and complete kind of understanding of what it looks like and how they kind of tell that across their story. So having this idea of kind of winners and losers before and after, clear stakes is important. But of course, you have to be able to communicate that to your buyer in a way that's going to be compelling. And that's where the story comes in. So the story really exists to take this idea, take this belief statement, and communicate it to the buyer. You think about all those stories I talked about a few seconds ago that kind of persisted through human history. All of them really fundamentally existed to share some kind of universal truth about the world. And your storytelling as a brand should function in the same way. Every time someone hears your brand story, engages with your brand, they should come away with a lesson or something that they've learned that's going to put them in a position to, in their own mind, advance themselves across this kind of gap between before and after. The structure that I use for our clients and that I would kind of encourage you guys to think about in terms of how you build out your own brand story is the narrative structure that's really kind of underpinned every message that's ever gained widespread adoption in human history. And that, of course, is the hero's journey, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. So the hero's journey is a storytelling structure that was uncovered by a comparative mythologist named Joseph Campbell in the 1960s. And he really looked at kind of storytelling across all different kind of cultures around the world and identified a 17-part arc that really kind of seemed to be consistent across narratives that were enduring and gained adoption kind of no matter where they arose independently on the planet. As you guys think about your story, I'm going to simplify things down for you a little bit, get you from 17 down to 5. And I think as you think about building out your brand story, I'm going to challenge you to kind of think about 5 key concepts that are going to help you take that before and after view of the world, that belief statement, and turn it into a story that's kind of ready to share. I'll give you some examples about that in a second. Those elements, of course, are the broken world of the story, the hero, the mentor, the magical gift, and the mended world. And to explain this quickly, I'm going to use, I think, what everyone on the call would agree is the greatest story ever told, and that's obviously Star Wars. So if you think about like any kind of story, it has to take place somewhere. It's got a setting. And in a fictional story, the setting of the story is always kind of some kind of fundamentally broken world. The reason for this is the problem state in the world sets the plot into motion. It gives the narrative its inertia. It gives you kind of wrongs that have to be righted. So you think about our earlier statement about that clear state of before and after. This is the articulation of the before state. If you're going to sell effectively and bring your ideas to market, you have to be able to point out to your buyer why the status quo is no longer acceptable. And I think like that can sometimes be uncomfortable for us, right? When we get in front of somebody and we start by talking about almost like a negative, a pain point and a problem, but it's that pain point that actually creates a filter between people that are good prospects or not, and that actually gives them the motivation to enter the funnel and to want to go through the customer journey and ultimately buy from you. A good broken world has typically got 3 components to it. It's going to have some kind of existential threat that exists, and that's going to tie pretty clearly to that before and after state I talked about a minute ago. It's going to have a problem that applies on like an organizational or communal level, and then it's going to have one that affects the individual buyer specifically. So you think about Star Wars, right? Broken world of Star Wars, the narrative begins, and Luke Skywalker is living in the middle of a desert, farming moisture with his miserable aunt and uncle under the oppression of an evil galactic empire. So like audiences see that, and it feels like those are wrongs that have to be righted, and that's what sets the story off. You want to anchor your own story in kind of tension and drama that's equally as dire. Now, in that broken world is the story's protagonist, its hero. In a fictional story, the protagonist is always some kind of powerless outsider, like a teenager or an orphan. Luke Skywalker obviously is both of these things. And the reason for this is because it allows the audience to empathize with the main character, feel their vulnerabilities, feel their challenges, really get invested in the narrative. It's like why people clap at the end of a movie. It's really annoying, but that's because they feel the catharsis that the character undergoes. You're going to create that same focus in your brand story by shifting the focus of your story away from yourself and actually onto your buyer, right? So the hero of your story, the focal point of the story that you're telling can't be you. It's got to be your customer, right? Every story that you tell has got to be their story and how they're going to navigate themselves out of that state of brokenness through the journey that you're going to paint out for them. The good news is you do have a role to play in this story, and that is the role of the mentor. So in every kind of fictional story, somewhere towards the end of the first act, the main character encounters a wiser, older character, inevitably with a British accent, who reveals to them kind of how much more is possible within them. This is when Obi-Wan Kenobi comes out of the shadows of the Dune Sea, and he reveals to Luke that he's actually a Jedi Knight. Your job is to release that kind of sense of empowerment in the buyer. You don't actually solve any problems for your customers, at least you shouldn't. Your customers should be solving these problems for themselves, and your job is to sort of unlock the knowledge or the skill or the latent ability within the customer to help them do it themselves. That's where they get that sense of empowerment, that belief that they can navigate the obstacles between the before state and the after state and lead to kind of like a sense of resolution. The way they're going to do this, and this is finally where your product comes into play, is with some kind of magical gift. You know, a fictional story that mentor character provides the hero with essentially a talisman. So they give them a physical object that also represents a connection to a higher set of values or a higher power. So in Star Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi gives Luke his dad's lightsaber, but that of course represents his connection to the Force. You want to think about your product in the same way, right? You're holding it back actually until relatively late in the narrative and relatively late in the story. But when you reveal it, it's this tool that your buyer can use, but it can't just be a tool in and of itself. That tool has to represent a connection to that sense of before and after that I talked about earlier. We talked about this idea of the belief statement, the thing that you share with your customer that makes them say, yes, these people see the world the same way that I do. The product really has to be an extension of that if it's going to be something people are passionate about and care about and want to buy. And then, of course, in a great narrative, the hero uses the knowledge from the mentor, the power of the gift that they're given. They go off, they defeat the kind of source of evil plaguing the world, and everyone lives happily ever after until inevitably the sequel. And that's kind of, again, how you want to think about the resolution of your brand story. So I keep talking about this idea of a brand story, but I think a natural question you might ask is like, do you mean a literal story that we would tell as a company? And the short answer to that is yes. My recommendation always for companies when they start to put together their strategic narrative is to truly kind of write it out and think about it as a story. This is the story from my current company, Woden, but we wrote one of these at my last company, Eloit. We wrote one for another one of my companies, Philadelphia Weekly. And I really believe that there's great power in taking the strategic narrative and really kind of codifying how that arc plays out across your buyer. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is it's going to force you to really think critically about that change that you're creating, that sense of before and after, how the narrative plays out. It's going to force you to get focused in on the buyer. When you start to write that story from the perspective of the customer, you get a better appreciation for what their pain points are, what their challenges are, what animates them. And it gives you the kind of language and the focus that you need to be able to talk consistently about who you are as a brand. I think a good story, a good brand derives everything from that. In fact, if you're skimming through the story kernel, what you'll notice is that the narrative beats of my company's strategic story perfectly match the origin story that I told you guys at the top of this webinar. Spoiler alert, our journey in our last startup was not as seamless as I made it sound at the beginning of the story here. There were all the kinds of twists and turns that you guys are all experiencing. But when I tell our origin story, I use it as an apocryphal way to define and describe our own strategic story. And you'll see that across our funnel and across any good company's funnel, they're constantly retelling variations of the same story that pulls out of the beats of their strategic story that allows them to really get those messages across to the buyer. They're going to help them understand the value that the customer delivers outside of product. And product, of course, plays a very small role ultimately in all of this. One of the big things I know that we all have a hard time with a lot of times is developing a really crisp and compelling elevator pitch. The value of a story like this is it also really becomes the foundation for a very effective way to talk about your brand in a way that's succinct. Ironically, it's a lot easier to write a 500-word story than it is to write like a 100-word elevator pitch. So when you start with this kind of big overarching story, you can start to distill that down into the things that are really short and compelling. So I'll give you guys an example of that. This is the cold pitch that our reps here use at Woden. They book discovery calls on about 20% of their pickups using this pitch, which I think is pretty good. You notice here that like the pattern of the pitch perfectly follows that hero's journey arc that I talked about a moment ago. We open with a problem state and try to make the buyer aware of kind of that broken world of their story. We then, of course, get focused on the buyer themselves, identifying who they are, hopefully seeing themselves in that, align them with our purpose, quickly identify why we're a credible person who can support them in that, and then help them understand what the resolution of that problem or that solution state could potentially look like. And we, of course, use variations of this across different stages of our funnel, different buyers, different prospects. But you can see that like by really focusing yourself in on the strategic story, you start to be able to develop a pattern that gives you these really kind of cool tactical applications that are not just relevant and resonant with the buyer, but also are consistent at every phase across the buyer journey. I would tell you, just as a quick side note, when you think about these types of things, would really encourage you to think about constructing your story in a way that interrupts your buyer's patterns. I talked earlier in this call about this idea that your real competition that you're fighting against is the status quo. And I think, when you build out a good pitch or a good story, that before state, which is the status quo, you really need to kind of give your buyer something that feels different, feels a little bit arresting, and kind of knocks them out of the pattern that they're in. That could be a question, it could be a provocative statement, but it should ultimately tie to that kind of problem state that you guys have at the beginning of your story. And what I'll tell you is, like, you're going to change this pitch obviously as you go kind of throughout the funnel, and I'm going to take a second and kind of map out for you guys how we do that. Eric, I'm not watching the chat though. I see like 3 next to that. Are there any questions I have to cover before I go into kind of talking about how this will play out in the buyer journey?
The 2 in the chat, we're just folks saying they have to run, but look forward to watching the second half of this.
Well, I hope they are if they see this recording now. Cool, thanks. So I want to talk a little bit about how you would kind of map this into the buyer journey and how the story would kind of evolve at each step of that. So I talked a second ago, of course, or have been talking about the hero's journey as a framework and an arc for how you kind of build out the story. What's really cool about the hero's journey is that the hero's journey almost perfectly actually mirrors your customer journey. So if you think about the process that people go through from the point where they first learn about your brand to the point where they progress towards a sale and ultimately are a happy customer, each of those stages of the buyer journey have a sort of a relationship to a stage of the hero's journey. And what that means is that you're going to be able to kind of pull the right messaging points out of each step of the journey as you work to develop this. So when you put in place that strategic narrative, what you're going to be able to do is think about how do you communicate the right information to the buyer at each stage of their kind of customer journey. So you think about like wanting to build an efficient funnel, you want these elements to move alongside of each stage of the journey. When someone first learns about your brand, they actually don't really care about you. They don't care about the product. They care about the problem that they're experiencing. So good messaging at the top of the funnel. These are really going to be things that drive urgency, right? So you think about like where you'd be running ads, where you'd be making cold calls or sending out cold emails. You want to always lead with trying to build that identification around the broken world with the customer. And again, when you think about like how you develop the broken world in your strategic story, what you're going to be able to do is get a customer who connects to you, not even around like a sales opportunity, but again, around a problem statement. And if you can help expose people to their problems, that can even come through education, right? You're able to get them to want to make the voluntary decision to enter the funnel. I think what's cool about a story-driven kind of buyer journey is that just like a regular story where you want to kind of get to the next chapter, you always want to see how it unfolds and how it develops. I think a good customer journey, right, does the same thing, right? It introduces new information at each stage, gets the buyer to a point where they want to learn more. They want to discover what the next step looks like. And I think you can do that really well when you do this in a narrative way. So the top of the funnel, we really want to focus on those pain points. We want to get the buyer to understand what are the opportunities they're missing, how is the world changing, what's the real cost that that has on them or on their business if it's a B2B sale. And that's going to motivate them to come into the funnel. And if you're thoughtful, you can do that in a way that doesn't necessarily feel negative, right? But you want to be able to expose to them the problem state that they're experiencing. Number 2, once you start to get into the sale, right, you're going to have some kind of conversion activity. So the person's going to book a demo call, or they're going to pick up the cold call, or they're going to answer an email. You're going to move into that kind of consideration phase of the buyer journey. That's the point where you want to get the focus of the story to shift from the problems that you solve to building empathy and attachment with the buyer. So we all know and have heard a million times, right, that sales are all driven, of course, by trust and by relationship. The biggest way you're going to do that is actually not by talking about yourself, and it's not by being anchored in the pain point anymore. It's going to be really building that clear one-to-one identification and relationship with the buyer. So we know good discovery calls are built around really understanding the buyer, getting to understand their pain points, right? Even in a B2C application, what you're going to want to do is, this is why like you think about how like in-store displays for B2C products try to like create displays that mirror what the customer looks like and mirror kind of how the customer would be. You do that because you're building empathy, right, with the buyer. It's why, like, for example, a brand like Dove has been so successful building its campaigns around that idea of like real beauty, because the customer sees themselves inside of Dove and they feel more relationship with the brand. They feel the brand has more empathy for them. So all of your second sort of stage of your buyer journey should really be all about building that one-to-one connection with the customer. I would challenge you guys as you think about like building out your strategic story and how to build out this customer journey, to really kind of work yourself around a clear psychographic profile of your buyer more than demographics. Like I think when we think about our customers, it's really easy to think about, yeah, I serve companies this size, this industry, and like this is the customer inside the company that I sell to. But even within that, there's going to be certain psychographics that drive the buyer to make that emotional decision. And all of your second sort of funnel stage activities, again, discovery calls, even sales collateral that goes to the customer at this time should all kind of reflect that person back. Again, ideally in a way that's oriented around their kind of own psychographic profile. And then as you get to the
Ed?
third phase,
Hey,
yeah,
Ed,
yeah.
can you
go
give a
ahead.
couple of examples of psychographics?
Sure. So like an example would be if I'm selling, I don't know, actually I'll use Woden as a quick example, right? So Woden sells, right, largely to strategic leaders in high growth organizations. That would be the demographic, right? CEO, CSO, whatever. But the psychographic profile I'm looking for is I specifically want C-level executives in those organizations who have had the experience of trying to pitch or explain their product and not have the buyer understand it, right? So now I can sell to that pain point for that person. So like, there's a lot of CEOs that are not a good fit for my company, even though they're the right company size, they've had a funding activity, right? They've done all the things that we would expect. Some of them are really good salesmen, and I don't want to talk to those guys because they probably don't need me, right? But when I think about the person who I get on the phone with and I say, do you ever feel like you talk to your prospects, they just like don't get what you're talking about? If I see that person's eyes light up, right, I know that I'm going to have really productive and helpful conversation with them because I've connected with them in a way that's psychological, not demographics, right? You think about like, I would say a company that probably actually does this really well is Peloton, right? You know, Peloton has served a really wide swath of people demographically, right? You've got people that are old, people that are young, people that are fit, people that are not fit, right? But they've kind of created this idea, at least they did during the pandemic. I guess they've kind of fallen on harder times now. But at one point, they were really good at creating this idea, right? Of like this idea of like people who want to live this like aspirational fitness lifestyle from home, right? They like made, put a lot of joy into the activity. You think about like on the B2B side, I would definitely say like another good example of a company on the B2B side that does this really well right now. You're right. You know, you always hit someone puts you on the spot and you like draw a blank on like good examples of this. But yeah, like actually like a great, good. Sorry, good.
That actually intersects with my next question, which is
Okay.
I think a lot of times people come and do these seminars and give us examples of like big companies, you know, like Dove and Peloton. And it's like,
Yeah.
great. They have, you know, excuse my language, a fucking team of people on
Yeah.
this. Who are people who are teams of 1, 2, 3 who
Yeah.
have like just for my you know, my example, I have a small but decent social media following. That's where I'm really
Yep.
building my voice. But it's me. You know, like what are examples of people who are smaller and building? I think a couple people on here have like consultancy style businesses.
Yep.
Who are doing this well. Do you have any? And
Yeah,
not to
no.
put you on the spot. You can
No,
we
no,
can
no.
talk about it later.
Actually, ironically, the smaller ones are easier because our clients don't tend to be the Pelotons of the world. I use Peloton and Dove and stuff like that because that's what most people know. No, my clients tend to look a lot more like you guys. So those are stories for me that are actually way easier to tell. So I'll use a good example. So we worked a couple years ago with a like 8-person company. So not quite 1 or 2, but still in your kind of realm, right? And they're called Spiro. They're a CRM. And when we started working with them, you know, small company competing against Salesforce, HubSpot, and like their big problem, of course, like you said, is you get Salesforce, HubSpot, fuck ton of resources to use your terminology, you know, how do you use your 8-person company kind of compete against that? And like from a demographic standpoint, the buyer is the same. The person who makes the CRM decision is the same person, no matter whether you're selling Salesforce, HubSpot, you know, Insightly or Spiro or whoever else, right? So we had to think about how do we segment that buyer down in a way that's psychographic, who's really going to kind of care about what Spiro does. And in the case of Spiro, we started as we always do with that clear sense of like before and after, right? And the Spiro kind of belief statement was built around the idea like that CRM is inherently like evil. Their company's mission is to kill CRM, despite the fact that they are a CRM platform. And when we started thinking about like what the problems were here, what we realized was there was this segment of the market that had experienced failed Salesforce deployments. So same demographic buyer, but people who hated CRM as much as Spiro because they had paid a ton of money to deploy Salesforce and totally fallen on its face. It was a complete disaster. We said, you know what, like this is a small segment of the market, but like you guys can be a serious company if we do nothing except for go after people that hate CRM as much as you guys do. And their entire sort of psychographic profile of their buyer and everything in their consideration funnel was all a stage of their funnel was all built around failed CRM deployments. How much do you hate CRM? Which seems counterintuitive for a company that's then going to try to sell you a CRM. But what it did was create this like immediate identification with the buyer. It also segmented them out of a market where frankly they could not win. They could not be the winning CRM on the planet, right? And it allowed them to kind of pull out a corner of that and be really, really, really effective. I'll use a second example. We're working with another company right now. They sell, I'm glad you're all sitting down. This is very exciting. A mobile powered cart for warehouses, which is essentially a battery on wheels that you put a computer on top of. And they've had a really hard time building like differentiation around this product because it's literally a battery on wheels that you put a computer on top of. And like people love them who have them, but it's really hard to build that urgency through the buyer journey. And what we decided to do in their case was actually move them in this case, the opposite approach of Spiro, move them into a bigger category. So in their case, we decided to help them move into the idea of selling against automation in warehouses. So you have a huge bunch of companies out there that know they need to create automation within their logistics operation, but they do not have the capital to deploy robotics at scale in the warehouse. So again, same buyer demographically, same titles, same structure, but you've got companies that just don't have the capital to do that. And what we've been able to help them kind of structure and tell their story around is what we call the human element of automation. This idea of being able to yield a meaningful percentage of the benefits that would come from robotic automation, but doing it through your human workforce at a fraction of the cost. And again, that's an instance where you're selling to a psychographic person who has that aspiration to automate their operation, but has the inability financially to do it. And we can kind of fit in that gap that sits between that and says, look, the old world was you had this entirely manual human process. Like the new world is we know that there needs to be a lot of automation within your operation to stay competitive, but there's big obstacles in terms of capital deployment, getting rid of your people, change all these things in the middle. The way that we're going to help you, this company also called Newcastle, the way Newcastle is going to help you navigate that, right, is going to be to think about how do you take the humans and get them like 80% to this endpoint. And so I think those are like, just I don't know if those are more relevant to you, but kind of two small examples of how you would do that on a scale that's not a huge publicly traded company.
Yeah, those are super interesting. They actually have led me to a third question, but I'm going to wait till you're done with, I'll wait till the Q&A. But
No
yeah,
problem. You're okay. Good. Well, and by the way, for everyone's benefit, I'll just assume you want me to tell stories about companies you've never heard of going forward, which is fine. That's again, ironically easier for me. We don't have a lot of companies that you would recognize their logos offhand. They're all, I think, in most cases, very successful businesses, but tend to be smaller or growing. So I have way more of those examples than I do of big companies. So you're actually bailing me out, Grace. Thank you. Yeah. So that's in the consideration phase where we want to build that like one-to-one attachment and empathy with the buyer. And then, of course, as you get to the bottom of the phase, bottom of the funnel, evaluation before the kind of point of sale, that is finally the point where you start to shift the focus to you a little bit. This is where you want to assert credibility, why someone can trust you, why someone can lean on you. And then you'll notice like everything else, like product, experience, all really should sit on the other side of the sale. You should be able to get the buyer to more or less make a buying decision based on alignment of pain point, their belief that you uniquely understand them, and their assertion that, or their belief that you're credible in your ability to guide them on that. And I think if you run a good sales process, by the time you get to the bottom, the product should more or less kind of be an output of that, right? They say, yeah, I see the world the way that you see it. I'll use the Spiro example. You're right. CRM is a disaster. No one uses it. Totally kills my reps. Yeah, no, I know. I can't believe you guys had a failed Salesforce deployment too. It's terrible. It killed my business when I'm in that identification phase. Hey, look, I get this. Here's how we've done this. Here's how we think about the structure of customer relationship management. Here's how we think you should treat your customers. The buyer's like, okay, I'm in. Problem, identification. I get that you think about this the right way. What do you guys have, right? And like that then allows you to introduce the product at the end of that. And it's why I think like a lot of times you see, if you use this approach, like even a product that might not be the best product in the market can gain a lot of traction really quickly because people are buying not the product, but they're buying the brand and the solution that they think that product can bring to them. So I think thinking about that, right, you'd really want to look at kind of like your messaging framework very much in the same way, right? So like you look across the buyer journey, like you're going to start to pull, if you build that strategic story I talked about a second ago, you want to really start to pull out of that narrative very distinct aspects of how you guys think and talk about your brand, right? So like case studies, for example, are a pure bottom of funnel evaluation tool. They're all about asserting credibility, right? And connecting with the buyer in that way. Your outbound messaging should be entirely pulled out of all of those kind of pain points that sit in the broken mold of the story. And you'll see that like as you start to introduce your customers and your prospects to different pieces of content and that have different messaging points from your strategic story as they move throughout the buying journey, what's going to happen is like at every funnel stage, there's always going to be new information for them to discover. The focal point of the narrative is going to shift a little bit, and it's going to make them excited and want to uncover more as they continue to go through this. So before I do a few minutes of Q&A, which I know Grace has got at least one to kick us off here, I'll leave you with the guys with a couple things. So the first thing I want to share is how to think about using story as your brand superpower. And Eric, I don't know if you're going to, I know you're going to send the recording, but I've also sent this deck to Eric. So, Eric, feel free to obviously share this with people as well if they want to use it. But as you guys think about how to do this, a couple things I really encourage you to kind of work through. So number one, start by identifying that market shift. What is the before and after, right, that's existing in your buyer's world? What is that like big belief that you guys have about how the world is going to be different going forward? Build clear stakes around it, a clear sense of change, and really kind of define what that belief is at your brand, because that's how you're going to build that like initial durable connection with your customer. Number two, really think about like, how does that before state have a relevant and urgent problem for the customer? And again, think about that in the context of an existential threat, think about it in the context of an organizational threat, and think about it in the context of an individual buyer, right? When you think about like how you're going to align, then think about how you would align your customer and your company with that kind of journey that you're starting to shape up, and really kind of push product to the back. Think about product as an extension and an output of these problem states, your customers' needs, and the relationship that you kind of forge with them. And then I think next, think about why you're credible to actually deliver on this. Like one of your kind of big advantages here and why story works really well is it gives you an opportunity, even as a smaller company, to reveal to your buyer like why you're uniquely credible relative to bigger companies or other kind of more entrenched players, or even the status quo, to be able to deliver on that kind of journey that you're talking about. Don't sleep on writing it down. Like I think a lot of people think about this a lot, right? You guys are entrepreneurs, probably in the shower in the morning, running through how you're going to do your sales calls today, how you're going to talk to your customers, but like write this down. Every day, everyone who comes in here, the first thing they have to walk by when they come in the front door of the company is that story kernel, right? Like I really believe that like seeing that every time I write copy for my company, every time I think about getting something where we're going to work on, like I pull it up and I read it and I look at it. And I really believe that having that defined, it keeps you anchored, it keeps you focused, it keeps you on message as you're continuing to talk to the people that you guys want to move through your funnel. And then look, like think about the funnel as the story as a consistent framework for everything that you do. If you get that story right, you should be able to derive from it all of those kind of tactical applications that you need, and ultimately kind of align your buyer journey with the messaging that's there to really kind of build something that's efficient and pulls people through this. I know I've thrown a lot at you all here. There's obviously a lot of depth and kind of complexity to this. I'm happy to recommend some different kind of books or podcasts or things you guys can look at as well to kind of continue to get you thinking about this. I would tell you, like, from our end, like we really, when we work with a company, try to help them think about how to use this story as a really expansive foundation. I mean, I'm a big believer that like every touch point in the company, if the company is really going to be successful, is going to get pulled out of this story, right? That we really want to be in a universe where, the mission, the vision, the values, the origin story, the differentiators, like every touch point that the company has really needs to get pulled out of that strategic story. And I think when you do that, you start to see that you're able to build a really hyper efficient and high converting sales funnel. So before I open it up for questions, the last thing I'll kind of leave you guys with is just a recap of hopefully what you got out of today. I'm hoping that all of you guys have got some clarity on why you got to have more than just a great product or service to be successful. Some ideas around kind of like how story can be used to really make you essential to your audience and some good ways to structure that. And hopefully a couple of thoughts already banging around in your head about how you can map that onto the different conversations you're having and the different aspects of your customer journey, and how you can use that to convert your prospects into customers and hopefully inspire your customers to go out and evangelize on your behalf. So with that, I think we've got about 10 minutes left, and I will stop and would be delighted to answer any questions that folks have.
Hey Ed, thanks for your time today. Hi guys. So quick question, is Salesforce actually so bad?
Say that one more time.
Sorry. Is Salesforce
Sales-
actually so bad? Because my company is focusing on development in the Salesforce.
It's a great question. So I don't think that, first of all, this is going to make me sound like a peak capitalist. I don't think that any company can be good or bad. I would tell you that it's all to me about matching the company with the right persona, right? Like, no company is going to have 100% market penetration. I think a big part of building out the right narrative and the right strategy is connecting your company and the problem that you solve and the customer that you sell to very, very tightly, right? Spiro is not trying to kill Salesforce. They're not going to, right? There's companies that have super complex CRM needs, right? I think, like, at least from what I know about Salesforce, we're on HubSpot, not Salesforce, but what I know about Salesforce, right? Like, if you have like very custom, very specific, very demanding needs for like CRM and customer management, like Salesforce is probably the best option that's out there, right? On the extreme other end, there's a lot of smaller companies that probably don't even need HubSpot. And I think, like, to me, when you guys think about coming to market, one of the underappreciated things I think in this story here is figure out that before after, figure out that pain point, and then you've got to think about like who's the buyer, that psychographic profile that we were talking about earlier. That, like, if that world persists just one more day, it's going to kill them, right? Because at the end of the day, people aren't going to move through your funnel because they've got cash they want to burn. They're going to move through your funnel because they believe if they tolerate the status quo for another day, they're screwed. And I think that level of urgency actually comes not from changing the product. In a lot of cases, it doesn't come from changing the messaging. It just comes from really tight alignment between problem and a very specific buyer, and getting those two things to match up as tightly as you possibly can.
Hey,
No,
Ed,
Salesforce is not evil.
Sorry, Ed, do you mind stopping your screen sharing
No,
so
not at all.
people can see you?
Yeah. How's that?
Thanks. Thank you a lot, Franz.
Most people would not want to see me, but we'll go with that. No problem.
Okay. Ed, what do you think is so like a founder, let's call it like sub 6 figures sort of here. My initial gut reaction would be like everything else where we're looking at like a 5-figure payment for this kind of service is like not worth it yet, like worth it to sort of muscle through on my own. So I have sort of a 2-part question here. One is like, at what point do you find it most useful for companies to come in and do this kind of service with you? And then second, if someone is like muscling through, what are the biggest blind spots you see founders having when they create their story?
Yeah,
That's too confusing?
No, not at all. I'm actually answer your second question first, right? Because I really believe that you ought to go through an exercise like this and think about this, whether you hire somebody or not, right? I mean, like I go back to, I started doing this because my last company was just totally failing and we could not find someone to help us with this, and like really kind of had to use your term, muscle through it myself and kind of come to a good conclusion about it. So I think you ought to do this no matter what, right? Even if you follow that, whatever it was, 8 bullet points I put up a slide before, just sit down and say, all right, how are we going to think about this? How are we going to go through this? What are we going to do? I would tell you, like, the biggest, I think, pitfalls I see people fall into as they think about this. Number one, like lack of focus, right? Like everyone worries about, I think a lot of times like cutting down their market size. But if you think about like how you're coming into the market, like until you have like that, 13.5% market penetration, you're selling to a very, very, very small group of people. And like the more narrow you can get that, the more urgent you're going to feel, the more essential that you're going to feel. And I think like, a lot of companies, they say, but I don't want to cut people out of my market. I want to really be as broad as possible. And the irony is that like it's counterintuitive. Like being broad actually makes it harder to grow. So I would say like number one, narrow it down, get specific. I would think, and the number two, right, like get out of your comfort zone. I think in terms of like thinking about pain points. We all feel awkward when we start a conversation talking about pain points. We all want to start with that positive conversation. Hi, Grace, here's how I can help you. Here's how you can be better. Peak nice to have, right? That's why like a lot of people who talk like that, they get like a ton of discovery calls and they get ghosted after every discovery call because like you're not essential. Like, yeah, okay, great, nice person, who cares? You got to get the buyer to see like why the status quo is no longer acceptable, which like, again, feels a little uncomfortable to start, I'll say negative, but start with like the challenges they're facing. But that's what's going to get them to pull through the conversation. And then like last thing I would say behind that, right, is really do sell around belief, not product. We all want the product to do the hard work for us. We all like to think the product's good enough. I won't have to be in sales mode. I won't have to be in the product will just pull people through the funnel. But again, the reality is like, look at how many just crappy products dominate their market. Like it's not the product, like great products fail all the time. And it's the buyer's belief in the brand, right? That I think is really kind of the enduring advantage. And then to your question about when would you actually bring someone in to do this? I would tell you, like, you wouldn't want to do this until you had a really clear focus on kind of who your buyer is, right? Feel like there's good fit with that buyer, and then are ready to scale. Like I think that would be reductive, but if you think about a good sales funnel, there's really only a couple components, right? You got to know who you're talking to, right? You've got to feel like you've got the capacity to execute a motion to get in front of those people, whether that's trade shows or cold calls or marketing. And 3, you've got to have a product that they want to buy. And I think if you've got those 3 things, you can start to think about how do I build the right story that really accelerates that growth. But story's not going to fix a bad product. It's not going to fix not having the capacity to put it into the market, and it's not going to fix knowing really ultimately who the people are that you want to connect with.
Thank you.
Any other questions I can answer?
I have a me specific question that I wouldn't ask if no one else. Sorry, Ed. Anyone else have a question? Tristan? You good? Okay. Okay, this is me specific. Sorry, guys.
All good.
So Ed, I started my company 3 years ago. It's a workshop product for teams. I like do culture workshops. I got on social media about 18 months ago, and I've had kind of like a explosion in that area. And so what is compelling about me and my product has really drastically changed because of I think the like social proof and the way people are resonating with it. So that it's been Eric has actually been really helpful, and that's why I'm on here today, because he was like, you got to come listen to this today. Trying to talk about my value prop as it's like shifted so much really in the last like 6-10 months. So particularly on the social media piece, right? Like, how do I use that? How do I use that to help me understand what it is people are resonating with?
Well, so think about this, right? Like if you think about anyone who's already following you on social media, presumably and this goes back to like, I would think like mapping where people are in the buyer journey, because you're going to deliver different content at different times. Like if they're already actively engaging with social media, they probably have some level of sort of awareness and problem identification already solved. Like what you're saying resonates with them as a problem. And like number 2, like they clearly feel like you have some level of empathy and speak to them because they're continuing to follow and engage, right? So what I would think about is like, how do you then assert credibility in a different way? Like, and I would think if they're not converting out of the social media activity, there's probably some separate motion. I wouldn't change your social activity because that's obviously a top of funnel tool for you that's pulling, and mid funnel tool, right? That's pulling people in and engaging them. But the question is like, what's the follow-up, right? Whether that's a piece of content delivery, right? Or a one-to-one discussion and engagement with them, right? That then allows you to assert why you're uniquely credible to help them kind of solve that problem, right? I think it's, you definitely can't go from that social media activity to a sale. So like my next CTA would not be like, buy this product, because there's like a missing gap there, right? At the bottom of the funnel. And you got to figure out what's the right bottom of funnel motion there. Is it like a demo? Is it a consultation? Is it, right, something else that like allows you to assert credibility in your ability to solve that problem for the buyer, and then you can kind of convert them at the bottom of the funnel from there.
Okay, that's helpful. That makes sense.
Cool.
Thank you.
Well, I know we're at time. So before I wrap, what I'll say is we're happy to connect with anybody on social media. Pretty easy to find. My email is at the beginning of the deck. Feel free to drop me a note if you have any questions, or add me on LinkedIn or whatever. Happy to connect and chat. And hopefully everyone got a little bit of value out of today, and this was gave you some helpful things to think about. So Eric, thanks for having me on. Much appreciated, and enjoyed the opportunity to spend lunch with you guys. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming in and doing this. We'll shoot out this recording. If it's cool with you at all, include your email and LinkedIn profile and company website. and I will attach that in there. But thanks everybody for hopping on. Ed, appreciate you doing it, man.
Perfect. Thanks. See you guys. Take care.
Awesome. Cheers.